Small editor's footnote here. I did not realize I was going to be this fast when I talked, so if there's any problems you have or any misconceptions that you might need to have clarified, then just ask me after the video ends. Well, hey there, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about the things they carried by Tim O'Brien, specifically the passage The Man I Killed, which we will be going through an oral commentary and how we're going to be looking through the characters and how it differentiates from other passages, etc. The main topic of this chapter revolves mostly around Tim O'Brien, however Kiowa comes into the mix later on in the chapter. But before we get to talk all about that, let's talk a little bit about the story. To sum up the first parts of the chapter, it's essentially Tim O'Brien looking at the man he had killed. It was a Vietnamese man who had looked like just completely grotesque from head to toe with a bunch of wounds. And as you read through the passage, you can still commonly see that constant theme going out throughout the novel about how they constantly repeat what they're saying, which means that it's not only significant, however, it shows something about Tim O'Brien's character. There's a very specific detail about this chapter which is especially different from a lot of other ones, because this chapter not only goes into Tim O'Brien, however, it goes into the first perspective. This is extremely different than many other chapters because it's only able to go into so much detail about the other characters. However, going through Tim O'Brien's mind right now, we're able to see as to what he's trying to portray and how he views everything. And as you oversee through the passage, you can see a lot of what Tim O'Brien is experiencing. He's experiencing a lot of guilt. And on top of all of this, he begins to think to himself and starts to connect to the man. As a way of coping with the fact that he had felt guilty, he began to connect himself with him, thinking about how he had a life, thinking about how his life would have changed. Now, I think I've already talked enough about Tim. Now let's talk about Kiowa. Kiowa plays a significant role in this passage because it shows a lot about his character as well. Now, I understand it's not as important as Tim. However, it's still significant enough to the point where we're able to understand something more about Kiowa. Now, Kiowa has always been shown to be this caring person, and throughout this passage, he kind of shows that, and that's shown when he's trying to comfort Tim, saying, there's not really much you could have done, we have to move on, and he's trying to get him to open up to him, but ultimately it ends in failure. Not too different from the Kiowa that we see, but still an interesting detail. Now, the language is important used in this topic because not only does it discuss the characters, however, it discusses the underlying conflict as discussed before, Tim O'Brien's guilt. Now, as touched on before, Tim O'Brien's perspective is written in the first person, very different from the rest of the novel. And that is also very significant because it gives a new form of thought inside of the reader's head. Now we're able to see things from Tim O'Brien's perspective, and that gives us a much better opinion on how he thinks and what we're able to expect from Tim. Now let's take a little break from talking about all the characters and focus on the setting for a minute. The setting, as most of the book takes place in, is in Vietnam. It's where a lot of war takes place, a lot of things happen, especially relating to the topic of this chapter, which is guilt. Now, throughout the war, Vietnam is shown to be this place where a lot of soldiers tend to see a lot of the burdens that they carry, and throughout that moment of time, they begin to really show their colors, which, I mean, it makes sense. It's a war. Also relates back to the theme that we were originally talking about how everybody has a burden that they carry. And in this case, Tim is going to go over the burden that he carries himself and how that will ultimately affect the writing of the book. And speaking of the theme, the burdens they all carry is significant throughout this entire novel, and especially within this passage, because it now shows the actual writer itself's burden that he has to carry. And through that act of believing in something else and kind of putting the blame on something else, it really makes sense because you can imagine how he wrote the book itself. Because remember, a lot of what happens in this book is from the imagination. It didn't actually happen. And if you were to look at Tim O'Brien and how he's able to cope with this, he's able to connect his own self with something that actually happened, therefore alleviating the pain of the reality, which is not something Tim O'Brien only does. However, it's something that everybody else does too, which directly relates to subsequent development. He begins to use that kind of imagination, as seen before, to later write down into the passage the imagination that is used to overall write the reality of things in order to alleviate something that's being felt. And I'd say that shows quite a bit about Tim O'Brien as a person. So, moving on to the actual significance of the passage, it shows a great identification of theme, especially for Tim O'Brien as the writer. Once again, as stated before, the main theme that is trying to be addressed here is the burdens that we all carry, which is eminent throughout most chapters. However, as we discussed earlier once again, is that this one specifically goes around Tim O'Brien. Tim O'Brien is shown to have this constant nagging feeling of guilt throughout the entirety of this chapter, which now feeds into the topic of war, which can be seen eminently throughout the novel, which can be directly seen from the writer himself. Alright, that's all I have to say about The Man I Killed. Yep.